In the winter of 1903, the Alaskan interior remained one of the last unmapped frontiers of North America. The Klondike gold rush had passed its fever pitch, but men still ventured into the wilderness, chasing rumors of unclaimed streams and virgin ground. Most who went north that year returned empty-handed. Some never returned at all. This is the account of what happened to four prospectors who established a winter camp along the upper tributaries of the Koyukuk River, roughly 80 miles from the nearest settlement. The testimony comes from the journal of Samuel Harrigan, the only member of the party to reach civilization alive. His account was dismissed as the delirious raving of a man suffering from exposure and starvation. The camp he described was never found. No bodies were ever recovered. What follows is reconstructed from his written words and the brief statement he gave to the territorial marshal before his death in February of 1904. So, before we continue, tell me one thing in the comments. Are you watching alone, or is someone with you? And please make sure you leave a like and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. My name is Samuel Harrigan. I was 28 years old when I went into the Alaskan interior with 3 other men in October of 1903. What I am about to describe happened over the course of 6 weeks during that winter. I've been told that no one believes me. I've been called a liar and worse. But I set this down as truthfully as I am able, while my mind is still sound enough to remember. We were not fools. We were experienced men. Thomas Garrett had prospected in the Yukon for 5 seasons. Daniel Pruitt had worked timber camps in British Columbia and knew how to survive hard winters. Albert Chen had come from California, but had already spent 2 years in the north. I myself had been a surveyor's assistant and understood maps, coordinates, and wilderness navigation. We pooled our resources and purchased supplies for a 4-month expedition. Our plan was simple: reach the upper Koyukuk before the first heavy snows, establish a winter camp, and begin prospecting the smaller tributaries that fed into the main river. We would work through the winter, cache whatever gold we found, and return to Fairbanks in the spring. Everything went according to plan at first. We traveled by riverboat as far as we could, then hired local guides to help us haul our supplies overland. The guides were native Koyukuk men who spoke little English. They brought us within 15 miles of the location we had selected, then refused to go farther. Garrett, who knew some of their language, tried to negotiate. They would not be persuaded. One of the older guides drew symbols in the dirt, circles, jagged lines, something that resembled a handprint. He pointed north, toward the direction we intended to travel. Then he shook his head and walked away. The others followed. We never saw them again. We debated what to do. Garrett suggested we reconsider. Pruitt said the guides were only trying to scare us into paying more. Chen pointed out that we had already spent most of our money and had no choice but to continue. I agreed with Chen. Turning back was not an option. It took us 3 days to haul our equipment the remaining distance. We found a suitable location for camp, a narrow valley sheltered on 3 sides by ridges, with a frozen stream running through the center. There was timber nearby for firewood and construction. The ground showed traces of mineral deposits. It seemed ideal. We built a sturdy cabin using logs and packed earth. We constructed a cache elevated on poles to store our food supplies away from animals. We dug a fire pit and cleared paths between the cabin, the cache, and the latrine. By mid-November, we were settled and ready to begin work. The first 2 weeks were uneventful. We took turns prospecting along the frozen stream, breaking through ice to pan gravel from the riverbed. The yields were modest but promising. We saw game, ptarmigan, hares, a few caribou in the distance. The weather held. Morale was good. Then the food began to disappear. It started small. A sack of flour had been torn open. We assumed it was a marten or a fox that had somehow climbed the cache poles. Garrett reinforced the structure, wrapping the support beams with sheet metal to prevent climbing. We thought that would solve the problem. 2 days later, an entire haunch of dried caribou was gone. The cache door had been forced open. The metal latch was bent. Pruitt examined it and said no animal could have done that. It would have required significant strength, and hands, not paws. We set a watch that night. Garrett took the first shift, sitting near the fire with his rifle. Nothing happened. Pruitt took the second shift. He reported hearing movement in the woods, branches snapping, something heavy moving through the snow. But he saw nothing. Chun and I inspected the area at first light. We found tracks. They were unlike anything I had ever seen. Each print was approximately 18 inches long and 7 inches wide. They were barefoot, clearly showing 5 toes and the impression of a heel. But no man could have made those tracks. The stride length was over 6 feet. Whatever had walked through our camp was enormous. We followed the tracks for a quarter mile before they disappeared into a rocky area where the snow had been blown clear. Pruitt suggested it might be a bear walking upright. Garrett said he had never seen a bear print that looked like that. Chin said nothing, but I could see the unease in his face. We reinforced the cache again. We began keeping the rifles loaded at all times. We decided that 2 men would stand watch each night instead of 1. The tracks appeared again the following week. This time, the prints circled the entire camp. They approached from the ridge to the north, moved along the eastern tree line, passed within 10 feet of the cabin, and continued south before vanishing into the forest. The creature, whatever it was, had walked a complete perimeter around us. It had also been to the cache. The door was intact, but there were scratch marks on the metal sheeting. Deep gouges, as though something had tested the strength of our defenses, and then moved on. We held a meeting inside the cabin. Garrett wanted to leave immediately. He said the tracks were a warning, and that we would be fools to ignore it. Pruitt disagreed. He argued that we had invested too much to abandon the camp over footprints. Chin suggested we set traps, bear traps with heavy chains, positioned around the cache and the cabin perimeter. I sided with Chin. I did not want to leave. I told myself that we were rational men, that there had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps it was a native hunter trying to scare us off the land. Perhaps it was some large animal we had simply failed to identify. I convinced myself that leaving would be cowardice. Garrett reluctantly agreed to stay, but only for 2 more weeks. If the disturbances continued, he said, we would pack up and return to Fairbanks regardless of the cost. We set the traps the next day. 4 of them, positioned in the snow around the cache. Each trap weighed over 40 pounds and had jaws that could break a man's leg. We baited them with meat and covered them lightly with snow. Then we waited. That night, we heard it for the first time. It was past midnight. Chun and I were on watch, sitting near the fire outside the cabin. The sky was clear, and the stars were bright enough to cast faint shadows on the snow. The temperature had dropped below 0. Everything was silent. Then, from somewhere in the forest to the north, came a sound I can only describe as a low, resonant call. It was not an animal noise, not a wolf, not a bear, not anything I recognized. It was deep and sustained, almost like a horn being blown, but with a guttural, organic quality that made my skin crawl. Chin looked at me. I looked at him. Neither of us spoke. The sound came again, closer this time. It seemed to echo off the ridges, making it impossible to determine the exact direction. I reached for my rifle. Chin did the same. We stood and moved toward the cabin door. Before we could reach it, we heard movement. Heavy footfalls in the snow, coming from the direction of the cache. I turned and saw nothing but darkness and trees. The footsteps stopped. Then one of the traps went off. The snap was loud and metallic, followed immediately by a sound I will never forget. A roar of anger and pain that shook the air and sent a flock of ravens bursting from the trees. It was monstrous, inhuman. I have heard men scream and animals cry out in agony, but this was something else entirely. The cabin door flew open behind us. Garrett and Pruitt stumbled out, half-dressed, rifles in hand. We all stood frozen, staring toward the cache. The roaring stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then we heard the trap being torn apart. The sound of metal shrieking and chains breaking carried clearly through the cold air. Whatever had been caught had freed itself. We heard it moving, crashing through the underbrush, snapping branches, retreating into the forest with thunderous, uneven steps. We did not go after it. We stayed together near the cabin until dawn, rifles ready, feeding the fire to keep the light strong. No one slept. No one spoke. When the sun finally rose, we went to investigate. The trap was destroyed. The jaws had been wrenched open with such force that the steel had bent and fractured. The chain, thick iron links meant to hold a grizzly, had been snapped in 2. There was blood on the snow. Not much, but enough to confirm that the trap had done some damage. We followed the blood trail. It led north toward the ridge. The tracks were the same as before, but now there was a noticeable drag to the stride, as though the creature was injured and limping. We followed for nearly a mile before Garrett stopped and refused to go farther. He pointed ahead, toward the ridge line. There, just visible against the gray sky, was a shape. Tall, pale, standing motionless among the trees. It was watching us. We stood there for what felt like a long time, though it could not have been more than a minute. The figure did not move. It was too far away to make out details, but the size was unmistakable. It towered above the surrounding pines, at least 9 or 10 feet tall, perhaps more. Pruitt raised his rifle and fired a single shot. The distance was too great. The bullet struck a tree trunk well short of the target. The figure did not react. It simply turned and disappeared over the ridge. We returned to camp in silence. That afternoon, we held another meeting. This time, there was no debate. Garrett said we were leaving. Pruitt agreed. Chin said nothing. I did not argue. We would pack what we could carry and begin the journey back to the nearest settlement the following morning. But we waited too long. We spent the rest of that day preparing for departure. We sorted through our supplies, taking only what was essential: food, blankets, ammunition, and a few basic tools. Everything else would be left behind. The gold we had found, a few ounces cached in canvas bags, was divided evenly and packed into our rucksacks. No one complained. No one looked back. We agreed to leave at first light. The plan was to follow our original route back toward the river, where we hoped to find the remains of the trail we had used on the way in. From there, we would navigate south toward the settlements. It would take at least a week, possibly longer in winter conditions. But it was our only option. We maintained a watch rotation that final night. Pruitt and Garrett took the first shift. Chun and I tried to sleep, but rest was impossible. I lay awake on my bedroll, listening to the fire crackle and the wind moving through the trees outside. Every sound felt amplified. Every creak of the cabin walls made my heart race. Around midnight, Pruitt woke us. He said Chin needed to take his shift. Chin rose without complaint and dressed quickly. He took his rifle and stepped outside. I heard him exchange a few words with Pruitt and Garrett. Then the cabin door closed, and I was left alone with the two of them. Garrett sat near the stove, cleaning his rifle. Pruitt lay down on his bedroll, but did not close his eyes. I pretended to sleep. Time passed slowly. I do not know exactly when I realized something was wrong. Perhaps an hour had gone by. Perhaps longer. But at some point, I became aware that it had been too long since I had heard Chin moving outside. There had been no footsteps. No sound of wood being added to the fire. Nothing. I sat up. Garrett noticed and looked at me. I asked him when he had last heard Chin. He frowned and said he had not been paying attention. Pruitt rose and went to the door. He opened it and called out. No response. We grabbed our rifles and went outside together. The fire had burned down to embers. The clearing was empty. There were no tracks in the snow except our own from earlier in the day. Chin was gone. We called his name. Our voices echoed off the ridges and faded into silence. We searched the immediate area, around the cabin, near the cache, along the tree line. There was no sign of him. No tracks. No indication of a struggle. It was as though he had simply vanished. Pruitt found Chen's rifle leaning against the side of the cabin, exactly where he would have set it down if he had stepped away for a moment. But Chen would never have left his weapon behind. Not after what we had seen. Not on purpose. We continued searching for another hour, moving farther from the cabin, calling his name until our voices were hoarse. We found nothing. Eventually, Garrett said we had to stop. It was too dark, too cold, and too dangerous to continue. We would search again at first light. We returned to the cabin and barricaded the door. None of us slept. We sat with our rifles across our laps, watching the door and the single window, waiting for dawn. When the sun rose, we went out again. We expanded our search, moving in wider circles around the camp. Pruitt found something near the northern tree line, a patch of disturbed snow, as though something heavy had been dragged. We followed it. The trail led into the forest, winding between trees and over uneven ground. The drag marks were clear at first, but after a few hundred yards they became harder to follow. The forest floor was rocky and uneven, with patches of bare ground where the wind had blown the snow clear. We pressed on. The trail led upward toward the ridge. We climbed for nearly an hour, following the faint traces whenever we could find them. Eventually, we reached a rocky outcrop near the top of the ridge. The trail ended there. There was blood on the rocks. Not much, but enough. Pruitt knelt and examined it. He said it was fresh, no more than a few hours old. Garrett looked around and said we needed to leave. Now, I scanned the surrounding area. The ridge offered a clear view of the valley below. I could see our cabin, small and isolated, smoke rising from the chimney. Beyond it, the frozen stream and the endless expanse of forest stretching south. Then I saw it again. It was standing at the far end of the ridge, perhaps 200 yards away. Motionless. Watching us. The same pale figure we had seen the day before, only now it was closer, and the morning light revealed more detail. It was enormous, far taller than any man. Its body was covered in pale, colorless hair or fur that blended with the snow. Its limbs were long and disproportionate, with arms that hung nearly to its knees. I could not make out its face clearly, but I saw the shape of its head, large and angular with a pronounced brow. It stood perfectly still, as though carved from stone. It did not make a sound. It simply watched. Garrett raised his rifle. Pruitt grabbed his arm and told him not to fire. He said we needed to go back to the cabin, gather our things, and leave immediately. Shooting at it would only provoke it. I agreed. We began backing away, moving slowly down the slope, keeping our eyes on the figure. It did not follow. It remained where it was, watching, until we descended below the ridge line and lost sight of it. We returned to the cabin and gathered what we could carry. We did not speak about Chin. There was nothing to say. We all understood what had happened, even if none of us wanted to admit it. We left the camp within the hour. We moved south as quickly as the terrain allowed. The snow was deep in places, sometimes reaching above our knees, and the cold was brutal. We traveled in single file, with Garrett leading and Pruitt bringing up the rear. I walked in the middle, carrying my pack and rifle, forcing myself to put one foot in front of the other. No one spoke. We were all thinking the same thing, that we were being followed. I felt it before I saw any evidence. A pressure at the back of my mind, a constant awareness of something behind us. I glanced over my shoulder frequently, scanning the tree line, searching for movement. I saw nothing, but the feeling did not go away. By midday, we had covered perhaps 5 miles. We stopped briefly to rest and eat. Pruitt checked our compass bearing and confirmed we were moving in the right direction. Garrett said we needed to keep moving. We could not afford to stop for long. I agreed. We pressed on. The terrain grew more difficult as we descended into a ravine. The ground was uneven and treacherous, hidden beneath the snow. I fell twice, catching myself on tree branches before I could slide too far. Pruitt helped me up both times without a word. As we climbed out of the ravine and back onto level ground, I noticed the tracks. They were behind us, running parallel to our route. The same enormous barefoot prints we had seen at the camp. They stayed just inside the tree line, following us at a distance, never crossing into the open ground where we walked. I pointed them out to Garrett. He stopped and stared at them for a long moment. Then he said we needed to move faster. We increased our pace, pushing ourselves harder despite the exhaustion. The tracks continued to follow. Sometimes they disappeared for a stretch, only to reappear farther ahead. Whoever, or whatever, was making them was keeping pace with us effortlessly. We traveled until dark, stopping only when it became too dangerous to continue. We made camp in a small clearing, building a fire and huddling close to it. We did not set up any shelter. We agreed to take turns keeping watch, 2 hours each. Garrett took the first watch. Pruitt and I tried to rest, though neither of us could truly sleep. I lay on my bedroll, staring up at the stars, listening to the fire crackle and the wind moving through the trees. During Pruitt's watch, we heard it again. The same low, resonant call we had heard at the camp. It came from somewhere in the darkness beyond the fire's light, close enough that I could feel the vibration in my chest. Pruitt stood and raised his rifle, his hands shaking. The call came again, circling around us, moving from one side of the clearing to the other. It was toying with us. Garrett woke and joined Pruitt. I sat up and gripped my own rifle, staring into the blackness beyond the fire. We saw nothing. The calling continued for several minutes, then stopped abruptly. Silence returned. We stayed awake the rest of the night. At dawn, we found fresh tracks surrounding our camp. They formed a complete circle, no more than 30 feet from where we had slept. The creature had stood there, watching us, close enough to reach us in seconds. It had chosen not to. We did not discuss what that meant. We simply packed our things and continued south. The next 2 days passed in a haze of exhaustion and fear. We barely spoke. We rationed our food and melted snow for water. The cold seeped into our bones. Frostbite blackened the tips of Pruitt's fingers. Garrett developed a cough that grew steadily worse. The tracks continued to follow. On the 3rd day, we reached the frozen river. We recognized the landmarks. The river was the same one we had traveled along on our way in. If we followed it south, we would eventually reach the areas where trappers and hunters operated. From there, we could find help. We turned south and followed the river. The ice was thick and stable, and the walking was easier than it had been in the forest. For a few hours, I allowed myself to hope that we would make it. Then Pruitt collapsed. He fell forward onto the ice without warning, his legs giving out beneath him. Garrett and I rushed to him. He was conscious but unable to stand. He said his legs were numb, that he could not feel them. We helped him sit up and examined him as best we could. There were no visible injuries, but his skin was pale and his breathing was labored. Exhaustion and cold had taken their toll. We tried to get him to his feet, but he could not support his own weight. Garrett and I looked at each other. We both understood the situation. We could not carry him, not in our condition, not with the distance we still had to travel. Pruitt understood as well. He told us to leave him. He said we would move faster without him, that we had a better chance of reaching help and sending someone back. Garrett refused. He said we would rest here for the night and reassess in the morning. But I knew there would be no morning. Not for Pruitt. Possibly not for any of us. We built a fire on the riverbank and made Pruitt as comfortable as we could. We gave him our remaining food and an extra blanket. He thanked us and told us not to wait. Garrett still refused to leave. That night, I saw the figure again. It stood on the ridge above the river, silhouetted against the stars. Tall, pale, motionless, watching. I woke Garrett and pointed. He saw it too. We sat there, staring back at it, until it finally turned and disappeared into the darkness. At dawn, Pruitt was dead. The cold had taken him during the night. Garrett and I buried him as best we could, piling stones over his body to protect it from scavengers. Then we continued south. We did not speak. We walked for 2 more days, surviving on nothing but melted snow and willpower. On the 3rd day, we encountered a trapper's cabin. The trapper gave us food and shelter and guided us to the nearest settlement. Garrett died of pneumonia 3 weeks later. I was the only one who survived. I have told this story as truthfully as I am able. I do not expect to be believed. I do not expect anyone to search for the camp or recover what we left behind. The land has taken it back, along with Chun and Pruitt and Garrett. But I know what I saw, and I know that something still walks those ridges, pale and enormous and patient. Watching, waiting. I will not return to Alaska.